Before we went live here, we were all talking about our first jobs in the sales world. So yeah, I was my first job was slinging education, online education. I worked for an online university doing sales. It was spin bound, but I was not built for it. It wasn't for me. And then I eventually moved to basically being an account executive, or what did they call it? Education advisor or something. But it was mainly to ensure people like stayed in class or actually showed up. But yeah, I that experience being on calls made me very sympathetic to salespeople because I'm not built for that. Just not me. Yeah.
And Emerson, we'll do a proper intro in a second here, but what was your entry level role that led to where you are today?
Yeah, my very first sales gig was selling radiators over the phone in Tucson, Arizona. I did that for a very brief time and then got moved up to outside sales. And I will tell you, if you go to a mechanic shop and they're not there and you go take a nap in your car in 115-degree weather, it's not very good for you.
No, that sounds awful.
Yeah.
I would put that out there with my experience, which was selling timeshare vacation packages, Hilton Grand Vacations. That was an experience. If anyone has seen The Wolf of Wall Street, the office wasn't like that, but the culture of hustle and sell and close the deal very much felt like that. So if anyone wants to experience proper sales grind, that will do it for you. For those who are just tuning in, though, thank you very much. This is the Sprocket Pod. My name is Cameron Collins. I'm a revenue operations strategist with Rev Partners, community manager with Sprocketeer, and we have my co-host here, Mark Lerner with Deal Hub, and our guest today, Emerson McCuin, director of RevOps with Haas Alert. Emerson, go ahead and tell everyone a little bit about yourself before we kick things off.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I oversee revenue operations at my company. I started out obviously selling radiators over the phone, but eventually got into SaaS sales and worked my way up from an SDR to an AE. At some point, I realized that my success was coming from the systems that I had set up for myself, and I was getting a lot of attention from leadership asking what I was doing. And at some point, I realized, man, I just this is what I'd rather be doing than making cold calls on the phone. So I made the switch over to RevOps.
Yeah.
And I would say it's gone pretty well for you, at least from growing and developing your education and career in the industry, just from having seen you contribute everything that you have to the community. So, first and foremost, just from the Sprocketeer community, thank you for being as active as you are, because I know there are so many of us who really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I'm a firm believer that to get ahead in your career, you help other people. Like always been my main focus in life and in work, and it's worked out well.
And I know today we have a couple of really cool topics coming up. We'll be talking about how you can know your worth, how you really have to know your stuff in revenue operations to stand out and to move up the ladder. We'll be having a little bit of a technical conversation, diving in on best practices, some of the things that you implement at Hostler and things that other revenue operations professionals or HubSpot admin can apply. And then we'll talk a little bit about the differences in working for an agency versus working directly for a company. And so I want to open the floor for you because I know this was a bit of a hot topic in the Sprocketeer community when it comes to knowing your worth. Mark, I know you did some research into salaries, and so we'll touch on that in a second. But Emerson, when it comes to just like being valued as a revenue operations professional, how does one find that line in the sand, if you will?
Yeah, it can be tough. I think that I hear a lot of revenue operations folks who are frustrated because they're not getting the buy-in from the leadership team, or they're not getting there's not an understanding from on high how important revenue operations is to the organization. But those of us who are doing the work at the ground level fully understand how we can revolutionize and change the shape of a company and really this drive the success through our processes. And while it's challenging, there's definitely some things that we can focus on to gain the attention of the leadership team and to win them over on our side. And yeah, I'd love to talk a bit about some of those, but that's the overview of my my feelings about the topic.
I'm curious to hear your perspective because I know that I have been in many meetings, if not most of my meetings that involve C-level executives. I think that there are many revenue operations professionals who do end up having those conversations with either senior leadership or the executive team. And when it comes to understanding where you fit in the role of an organization, I think that it's a little interesting where sometimes maybe revenue operations professionals, because they don't have that executive title, they feel less than. And so, how have you navigated that relationship of understanding that your contribution is at an executive level because you have your seat at the table?
Yeah, I think my background in sales helps there because it's sometimes to win over the C-suite, you need to have a champion. And so that's something that I focus on, right? It's whose job can I make easier? Who can I make appear more successful? And a lot of times for me, that's VP of sales, right? If we have processes that are frictional in the sales process, and we can begin to remove that friction, and we can introduce strategies, and we can show them, hey, you have this number to hit this year. Here are some strategies that we can implement to make sure that you hit your number. You're their best friend. And the same thing, I really love the relationship between RevOps and your CFO, because the CFO is all about efficiency. And so if you can show them, hey, we're inefficient here, we're spending so much money here, here are some processes that we can change to bring in more revenue at cheaper costs, they're going to love you. And if you can really show them that you know what you're doing and they believe in what you're essentially selling to them, then they can be your champions and they can really do a lot of that political work in amongst the C-suite team to allow your initiatives to come to fruition.
That's an interesting tack to co-opt the CFO as your internal champion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think many people working at companies the CFO has had a greater impact lately, especially as budgets are being more closely scrutinized and the kind of open purse strings that we all enjoyed a few years ago have gotten to tighten. So it seems that the CFO's role has become increasingly important. And so I think it's a smart idea to hitch your wagon there as someone in RevOps. I like that.
Yeah, and so I think that you mentioned something interesting for yourself that I really resonate, which is having that background in sales. And I think it was a couple weeks back, you and I had a conversation about interviewing sales reps and how the leadership team shouldn't have hesitation on revenue operations talking to sales. And I'm really curious to hear your take because I know for me, I was the sales guy that wanted to be friends with the RevOps guys because I knew they knew how stuff was going on behind the scenes. And so, what's your take on having that relationship directly with the guys who are on the phone selling and bringing in the revenue?
Yeah, I like having a close relationship with my sales folks. And I'm somebody who will work with particular sales folks and say, hey, I'm going to pilot this strategy with some individual, and I strategically choose which reps I may use because I know that they're hardworking, and if they're just given the right tools, like they can blow their numbers out of the water. And I can use them as an example to say, hey, we should roll this out to the rest of the team. The issue with that is you should have a good relationship with your sales leadership team before you start doing that. And if you do, like my VP of sales trusts me, he sees me as a strategic partner. And so he knows that if I'm working with the sales reps, I'm not going to lead them astray. I'm not going to work against his goals. I'm not doing it for my own, sense of glory or acknowledgement, but this is to ultimately support him and his goals of making sure that his team's hitting their numbers. I'm also aligned with his strategy and making sure that I'm communicating, hey, here's how we can increase our average deal size by giving these target accounts to this particular rep. And let's work with marketing to do some account-based marketing to these particular accounts. And let's see the return on our investment with this small sample size. And, and typically we work at a company where we're a startup. We're figuring out our processes, but this company was grown organically. And when that happens, a lot of times they're not thinking ahead of time, how do I build this to scale? So that's what I'm coming in here to do. But that means a lot of our processes are messy. And the sales folks sometimes are like, where's our direction? And so they're really appreciative when someone comes along and says, focus on these accounts. Here's how we're going to strategize. And I work closely with them, regular meetings each week to look at their target accounts. And I think they're leaning on me more and more to understand, oh, Emerson has a really good strategic mind. I'm going to lean on that and for some guidance. So.
Yeah.
I remember back when I was still in a sales role and I was moving toward a path of leadership, I sat down with the CEO at one of the companies I was with, and I'd asked, how do I go from being sales rep to executive level? And something he said that had always stuck with me is, Cam, you're really great at sales and you know your numbers. But what I would need from you is being able to not just know your numbers, but know everybody's numbers and be able to take that and then build reporting and extrapolate on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really interesting because it took me from being a mindset of how do I perform to how do we get everybody rowing in the same direction.
Yeah.
And then moving toward revenue operations, of course, you take that and you pour fuel on the fire. What are some of the key things that people who are starting on the revenue operations journey, or maybe they don't really feel like they have everything figured out? What are some of the things that you feel like maybe they should focus on these key areas that can really help them to earn that trust and be viewed as a strategic partner rather than just a RevOps employee?
Yeah, it depends on where they're at. If they're a salesperson who's looking to make the jump, exactly what you said, build your reports, be successful. If you can blow out your numbers and your leadership team comes and says, hey, why are you hitting quota or exceeding quota when other folks aren't? And you can show them that it's due to your processes, they're going to want your assistance. And if you're the type of person who can share that with the rest of the team and you're not trying to squirrel away your little secrets, they're going to appreciate it. And they're probably going to come to you and ask you for help. I think that's in any organization, that is a very valued person. So I think somebody who's maybe early on in their RevOps role or sales ops role or what have you, I mean, if you're in a position, that's the best place to be because you're doing hands-on work. The hardest thing is like, who's going to give you a chance first? That was, for me, that was the tricky part. It's like, how do I can do all the reading and the studying and the learning and the practicing in my own HubSpot portals, but until someone's going to be willing to give you that shot, then it's worth nothing to someone else. It's all, you have to prove your worth and that you have to be trustworthy. But once you get that shot, it's just get your hands in there and do things. Start small, make little improvements, make sure that we're all in RevOps. And so we can see the metrics and we know eventually you begin to know the business better than anyone else in the entire company. And so track the metrics, track where you're at, take a snapshot of here was where everything is at when I started. In 3 months, here's where we're at now. And in a year, project it out, here's where we can be. And then have a strategy to get there. And then that's where your sales skills come in is here's the proof, here's how we're going to do it. And then selling people and bringing people along on that journey with you. And I think that's how you start to develop more of an executive presence too, right? It's, hey guys, here's the larger strategy. Show that you understand what's happening at the higher level and how you work that down to the very base level day-to-day operations. So that's what somebody in a C-suite level operations role needs to have is how do you tie in the day-to-day with the greater strategy? And once there's not a lot of people doing that. And I think part of that is because the lower you get, the less insight you have into what's going on at the higher level. And again, that's where your partnerships with your CFO or whatever other leadership partnership you can build, have good relationships there, and you'll start to understand the bigger picture just in the way that they're talking, and they'll give you insights. And that's my main focus at my company and how I went from zero to where I'm at today is through that strategy.
And what you were saying earlier about if you start hitting your numbers and doing really well, people will come and ask you how. That mirrors a lot of, I think, your own story, right? So you and I, a little backstory for the folks at home. You and I interviewed you at Inbound when I met Cameron as well, and you told your personal story, and it was very similar along those lines, which was actually a fascinating story. So yeah, it sounds like you're not just saying that abstractly. I think it's from personal experience.
Yeah, and really quickly, just to fill in, I was very successful as an SDR. And before I made the jump over to AE, they asked me to write the playbook because I've just showed them my systems and they're like, we need this throughout our entire SDR team. And then when I was in AE, I was very successful using similar strategies and just expanded on those. And then eventually I got into a role at a different company where I was in AE and was very frustrated by it was a very large organization and I couldn't get in there and create my own systems. And it was holding me back from being successful. They were a Salesforce organization. I figured out that I could connect HubSpot to my email portal so I could build my sequences in HubSpot. And I used HubSpot as a shadow CRM to run my own little operations within the company. Was super successful, started getting accolades at company meetings, and AE started coming to me saying, what are you doing? Can you show me? And I showed them my portal and can you build this for me? And so then I started doing that. And that's when I realized like, I'm tired of selling. I want to do this. And so I made the transition.
Yeah. And so you knew your worth with that. It's like, I think, a good transition, because from what I remember you saying, there was someone that had posted a question about looking for someone in a RevOps role and wanting to know what that job description was. And you basically were like, forget the job description, let me do it. And because you had the conviction and knew that you had value.
Yeah.
And I think that was awesome. But there may be folks out there that are holding back a little bit and not fully sure about their worth. So I think it's a good transition into kind of some of the stuff we were going to talk about with that. Yeah, I want to give everyone a little background about some of the research that we did that Cameron mentioned earlier. When I started at Deal Hub here 6 or 8 months ago, I was going through some of the old collateral, and there was actually this research that was done that never saw the light of day, because they had done kind of an analysis of salaries for sales ops, rev ops roles across the US, but it was meant to come out like mid-March 2020. And the day it was supposed to come out, the whole world shut down. And so it just got shelved. And I found this research, and it was pretty fascinating, but I realized that if I went back and conducted the exact same query on the same sources in late 2023, we would have this perfect view of directly before and post COVID and how that impacted. And so that's what we did. And so we found some super interesting research. And I know that I've shared it with you both, but needless to say that this role, we looked specifically at sales ops. And that's because back in 2020, that was a more common thing. And I want to make sure it was apples to apples search. But overall, the roles salary across the board, across the country, increased in a pretty healthy pace. But some of the interesting things about where those increases happen the most in terms geographically is also what experience level. So counterintuitively, we found that folks on the lower end of the experience level saw a much greater increase since 2020, and that the increase in salaries happened much more outside of some of the places people might assume salaries were higher, like where I live in New York or San Francisco, and much higher in places you might not expect. Like we found Minneapolis, Minnesota to be this huge outlier where, someone with 7 years of experience for a sales operations director role, that position had like a 70% increase in salary for that area. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, but it's a really interesting kind of jumping off point for discussing how someone, especially in this time where there's downsizing happening in some companies, someone in a rev ops role, someone with an ops background, how they can advocate for themselves and know their worth and ensure that whatever happens, they're going to be okay.
I think all of that research that you shared really points to company that growth at all costs era in tech is over. I never say that something is dead, and I see that all the time on LinkedIn, but I think this is one that I can confidently say like growth at all costs is dead. And yeah, I think efficiency becoming the name of the game. Companies are investing more into positions that can create efficiencies. And while I hate the term do more with less, I think that is something that RevOps allows for, right? It's how do we use our current headcount and how we maximize what they're capable of doing, and not putting more work on the table, but it's more about the work that they're doing, just make it more intelligent and strategic. Yeah. And man, if you can do that, like there's a reason that RevOps roles are supposed to be the largest growing, what I can't remember the phrasing that
I think
LinkedIn,
it was the number one job,
most in demand.
Yeah, on LinkedIn
Yeah.
last year.
Yeah, and there's huge opportunity there. So I wasn't super surprised to see, obviously, that there's a good growth rate for the role. And it makes sense too, with COVID causing more remote work is now more of a normal thing. It makes sense that you would see more growth rate outside of the expensive tech centers as people work from anywhere they want. And it's a nice balance because folks working in the middle of nowhere, middle of the country, where locally they may not have a good opportunity, they can go work for a company based in one of the tech centers. The tech center is probably paying them less than they would someone locally. And so there's a nice balance there and evening out.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of interesting migration pattern stuff that is probably well outside my wheelhouse of understanding, but I think intuitively I understood that there was a great shuffle happening in terms of people's decisions on where to live and what to do and how what you do impacts your decisions about where to live. And I think that clearly the reshuffle empowered the individual worker a lot to make those decisions. Specifically, when it comes to these ops roles, I was having a conversation last week and with a sales leader, so like a director, VP of sales, and he was basically saying how incredibly valuable this role is for their company and how aggressive they had to be to get somebody who was good in the role. And there's this saying, be a painkiller, not a vitamin. And I don't or be a vitamin, not a painkiller. I can never remember which one you want to be. But I think that in this case, the RevOps is I think the painkiller, the good one, the one you want to be, the better one. And especially do more with less as opposed to growth at all costs. That is the value that they bring. Having someone that's good at RevOps could potentially enable you to consolidate tools so that you don't have to have these disparate tools everywhere and all the kind of potential error points that involves, help you automate things so that you don't need, that you might be able to cut costs in terms of salaries. There's all sorts of things that someone in RevOps can do. And of all the jobs that would be on the chopping block, I think that would be one of the last. So
yeah, if you're good at what you do, then absolutely. And I think the more that somebody can pair a technical ability with a strategic ability, and I'm thinking of, as these companies cut costs, right? If you just take things away from people or make their job harder, they're going to want to go somewhere else. But you can really lean on your RevOps person to say, how do we raise quotas to where they need to be so we have good sales efficiency, but give them the tools that they need so that when we leave this quota conversation meeting with the sales team, that they're not leaving like, how am I supposed to do this? But they feel empowered to actually hit their numbers and they see it as an advantage. And I think you can have RevOps people who are super technical put together the numbers and make the numbers work out. But how do you have a RevOps person who's able to put together those numbers, but really factor in how is this going to affect the people? And that change management piece is huge for success in a RevOps role. Like, you have to think about the people. That they always say the RevOps is data, people, and process. And it was actually my CEO said, you should always put people first in that whenever you talk about it. People, process, data, but doesn't matter what the other two might shift, but people should always come first. And I think that's absolutely true, especially if you want to move up in a RevOps role.
Yeah, I would agree with that from the perspective of revenue operations is about empowering and enabling. And so it's not, I would say by design, it shouldn't be about having to constantly correct and fix bad behavior. It should be about enabling and facilitating good behavior. And to the point that you made about being technically inclined, and this is a definition that I had picked up from Matt Bolian from his RevOps summer school. He had defined revenue operations as the science of sustainable revenue growth. And I really think that resonates, especially now more than ever, because it's not just about how do we generate more revenue, but how do we do it sustainably? And one thing that I would like to suggest as a hot take, and Emerson, I'd be curious to hear your opinion if you agree or disagree, but I feel like it's important as a revenue operations professional to be extremely technically competent and to be strategic. So you have to be both. And I feel like companies need to make sure that they understand and respect the boundary and the line that is expected of them to execute on the technical side. And so, like, we've talked a little bit about the difference in using sprint points versus billable hours versus other product roadmap methods. But what would be your opinion as far as a company that says, I expect you to build this, or I expect you to do this next week? And then the RevOps professional now has to draw their line in the sand and say, this is how it impacts other things, or we can't move that fast. You can't expect that of me.
Yeah. I mean, so RevOps should be a strategic partner role. And if you're a strategic partner and someone puts something on your plate and they have these expectations, and you, through your own experience and through your understanding of implementing change throughout an organization, that's not going to be plausible. It's not going to be successful. I do see it as your responsibility to push back on that. And ultimately, it depends on If you are working for an agency where you don't have the day-to-day working relationships, maybe that's a little bit more challenging and you can make your recommendations, but ultimately it's up to the client. Me working embedded within one company, I do have more, I've been able to invest, I think, more deeply in the relationships that I have and built trust. And not to say that you can't have that trust in agency. I definitely think that's an important piece, but it does allow me to say, look, I'm just not able to do that right now. I will get to that in a month. I will, or this process is going to take 3 months because there's a planning phase and then there's a deployment phase and then there's a review phase. And so often if we skip that review phase, our anything that we've rolled out, no matter how perfect of a process it might seem, is going to fail. And so we're gonna that was one of my initiatives for 2024 is let's stop the change whiplash for our folks. Let's make sure that we're doing this intelligently. And I think they understand that's valuable. And as much as it's like move fast and break things, we need to temper that with sometimes to move fast, you need to slow down.
So I want to pair that with a question that was posed by one of the viewers who's watching, and they had suggested that when we look at people process data, it should be in the order of people first, right? And the suggestion that they alluded was we put the data part last because the last thing that we want to do first is replace the tech stack or add new software. And so just wanted to get your take on bringing that full circle with when is it appropriate to say, okay, let's bring in new software, let's update the tech stack versus let's update the behavior? Or how do you
Yeah.
go about breaking that down?
Yeah, I'll use a Deal Hub example. Our sales team was so used to using this one contracting tool. And I'll tell you from a data side, from a process side, it was absolutely terrible for us.
Mm.
And I did a demo with Deal Hub and I saw that this would solve all of our problems on the back end. And the thing is there was certain pieces of this old contract tool that our salespeople were so reliant on that it blew everything up for us. And it was frustrating for us from like our financial team was frustrated with the whole thing. I wanted to move over to this because there's so many manual processes that we had to do with this old system that the salespeople never saw. But ultimately, what it came down to was the sales team at that time period won out. And so we continued with our old tool. And the rest of the team, the process wise, like we dealt with it all. And part of that was on me for not including the sales team more, for not putting people first. I was putting process first.
Yeah.
And that whole transition failed for us. And we were able to work it out and figure out a longer term plan for the change. But so that was an area where there's so many different tools that I would love to implement at our company. But I know now that I have to say, I'm going to implement that tool a year from now, or 9 months from now, or 6 months from now. And here's the plan to get there. And that whole time I'm including people from day one. Otherwise, it's not going to be successful.
Yeah, change management is a killer. I have one of my earlier jobs in my career. I was working at a company that kind of was trying to transition from a more old school process to the current millennium, and they really were challenged with it. So like sales people were working out of spreadsheets, and like they were paying for Salesforce, and no one was using it because the salespeople just didn't. They were used to what they were used to, and they didn't care. They had their own thing, and they don't care about notes and tracking and all that. And there was never buy-in that was gotten internally, and so they were just paying for Salesforce, which was quite expensive. They still had the same problems where they just weren't getting visibility over their sales reps. And some of the people on that in the sales team had been there for 20, 30 years, and they're not interested in the cognitive investment that's required to learn a new tool. And I, as somebody on the outside looking in, I didn't have a solution for it because it's hard. I don't know how you actually overcome that.
It's tough with sales teams too, because I think they have a lot of leverage in the company.
Yeah.
And when a salesperson is able to say, if we change this process, I will sell less, then that goes a long way when people hear that. And obviously nobody wants to see that. And I think that there's certain tools that are coming, like Supert is a really cool tool because It makes the salespeople's jobs a lot easier. It's actually a venue for introducing change, which is something that I want to start leaning on it for. You can have, because you have your knowledge base right there, and then one spending time right in HubSpot. And so I'm looking at using that tool as, yeah, a way to introduce different ideas, a place that they can go all in one place to answer their questions. I think a lot of that change management comes to, how do I do this simple thing that was so easy for me, and I had the muscle memory to do it before, but now here's this change. If they can very quickly go to a place and say, do a quick search and say, how do I do this, and it's all laid out right there in a very easily understandable way. One of the things that I want to implement for my change management in 2024, if you haven't noticed, change management is kind of one of my central pillars for to focus on for 2024, would be to have some kind of a knowledge-based system where it's very easy to then implement the rest of the changes that I need.
How far have you gotten as far as exploring Supered for learning and development and learning on demand?
Yeah, I'm just cracking the surface. I'm just breaking into it. I just saw that they had released, I don't know what they were calling it, but it's the ability to enforce like an update. So when a user logs into HubSpot, there's a window that pops up.
Yeah,
And
the
when I
process
saw
rules.
that, oh yeah, so many gears started turning. I'm like, oh man, that's going to be good.
That is huge. And I know we talked about doing a little bit of a technical conversation today, so I'll do a super quick screen share. But I get really excited about Supered because I know for me as a sales rep, I wanted to do one thing, and that was sell. And I think most sales reps share that sentiment. They want to do their job, they do want to do it well, they want to ramp quickly. And anything that we can do in revenue operations to enable and facilitate that becomes a win. And so one thing that I've done, which I encourage and open you to adopt, but you can build a training and development dashboard. This is my version for HubSpot onboarding, but then you can scale it out to be relevant for company specific content and processes. And so it becomes a really exciting way now where you can both have learning on demand through Supered, you can have HubSpot training and content, but then you can also have company specific content and processes as well. If the wheels weren't turning, I hope they may be turning a little bit more now as well.
I think you can embed like Loom videos
Yeah.
to show people how to do things. Like yeah, well, it's a crazy tool. And I'm only scratching the surface on it. And I think what we need to do is have a session with who's doing, I know that Scott from Squad 4 did a really amazing, like what you can do with Super. He does some amazing things. Yeah, there's your video embed.
That's fun.
Yeah, it's one of those tools where it's just, man, the opportunities are endless as far as how you use it.
Yeah.
So I know when it comes to being able to really showcase your worth and climb the RevOps ladder, so to speak, RevOps in itself is a black box. There's so much to learn, so many avenues to go. And then you put it in the context of being a technical expert within HubSpot, that multiplies it exponentially. What are some things that you've found, and this is a super broad question, so pick anything, but what are some things, or what is a thing that you found that can be best practices that could be applied, whether that's how we gate and stack sales stages or creating and using lifecycle stages in HubSpot that maybe don't exist by default, right? I know there's a few things that out the box as a RevOps pro, most of us could probably go to any company and say, yeah, let's fix this.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit more difficult for me to answer. I tend to feel that every business is unique and so requires customization that's best for the business. So a RevOps person, and Cameron, in your role where you're working with lots of different companies, you're probably in a better position to answer it honestly than I am because I focus so heavily on my company. But there's certain processes where it's, yeah, these are generally the same, but then that you're going to need to go in and custom, whether that's life cycle stages, deal stages. And the best thing that you can do as a RevOps person is tailor processes to the company and to the people. And I think that's why it's difficult to have kind of a one templated RevOps way for every single company that everybody can adapt to and use to. And again, I don't want to be like a super fanboy here, but the ability to drop in processes and then you can focus on the customization with your time and energy rather than rebuilding all of the basic processes that are similar across the board. But yeah, for me, I think I do feel strongly like deal stages. If I'm building out deal stages, they should be customer centric. It's what does the customer need to do in order to buy from us? not trying to force them into our processes. I just think that for me, that's a best practice as a customer centric viewpoint. I think as a philosophy for salespeople to think about how they're partnering with the customer to go through the sales process, like the language should match how we want to be viewed as a company. I think that's an important piece. I like clean processes. So I think that deal stages they need to go through every stage of the process. There's very specific things that need to happen at each stage. And I'm a believer that like those should be automated. So when the properties are filled out, all those specific required properties are all met, then the workflow transitions to the next stage. That is something that I firmly believe in. I have people within my own company that, what about this stage? We want to add this stage in, and then you can have this deal stage process that's 10 extra steps that you don't really need in my mind. And so a lot of it's fine and balance. I don't want to force people into my specific systems just because I like the cleanliness of it all. So yeah, I think there's a lot of compromise that I have. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on though. Like, how do you work with all these different companies? What do you do?
Yeah, so to your point, where every business is unique, that is absolutely true. I think that when it comes to commonalities, there are oftentimes trends that I've seen. So, for example, life cycle stages oftentimes aren't defined or fleshed out. And I would say, I don't know if this was the case when you started building the Hostler instance way back when, right? But they have all the default settings. So it will automatically create an opportunity when a deal is created.
Right.
But maybe you have a stage zero and you don't consider that an opportunity because that's an SQL. And so you don't want that to automatically turn on.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of little settings like that where HubSpot out the box is great. It's fantastic at what it does. But when we look at it from a RevOps lens, it really requires us to go in and look at how do we take what is out of the box and then make it tailored to the business. I would say a general thing that companies could be mindful of is lists that are not being used for anything, whether that's reporting or workflows. The amount of lists that have never been opened that have no practical use, a lot of technical debt that could be reduced. And so
Yeah.
I think that that's the high level stuff. Mark, I know you're not super in it with a deal instance on a day to day necessarily, but I'm keen if there's anything that you've seen or heard or experienced in the community or your
Yeah,
take.
so this idea of technical debt is one that's on my mind a lot, not specific to my current role, but just generally from experience previous and current, as well as people I talk to. It's these systems that people use, let's say CRM, regardless of which one, is so critical to all these other systems that any can't delete an object or a field, or else you're not entirely sure all the things that are reliant on it, and so you just add on top of it, and it builds this huge pile of, as you said, technical debt. And then somebody new comes in, or someone takes over that role, and they're looking at 1,000 fields and a bunch of custom objects, and they have to untie this Gordian knot and figure out what's important, what's not. And it's hard. And yeah, I actually am interested with, for you, Cameron. I know because you work with a lot of accounts. Is it usually people that are just getting started, or have you ever been brought just an absolute jungle of fields and objects that you had to parse through to make things work?
So more of, no, I don't want to say more often than not. There's a good mix.
Yeah.
There's a good mix. And even in the Sprocketeer community, I've seen a lot of our community members who are freelancers or work at other agencies. And oftentimes the question gets brought up of, okay, I'm in a brand new instance. It has 900 workflows. There's 1,000 lists. There's 800 reports. Where do I start? Now, being able to answer that question, it depends, right? Where do I start? It depends. But oftentimes the instances that are totally empty, where we're starting from scratch, those are fun because we get to take them from 0 to 100, and I get to be the architect and I get to see everything built. The ones that have a lot of technical debt that's already in there, there's more cleanup, but it's very satisfying when you take something and, oh, there's 45 dashboards. None of them have been looked at in the past 6 months. And 3 months later, I can now say, hey, here's 8 dashboards, and they're being used on a weekly basis. So there's a lot more to untangle with an existing instance, but again, there's a lot of universals that I've seen, whether that's, again, the way that life cycle stages are treated in default, whether it's having naming conventions for templates or lists or workflows, or adding a description to your workflow. So it says what the intended purpose of the workflow is. That's an oversight that I would say virtually everyone makes across the board.
I think we're all
And
guilty of it at some point, right?
yeah, and so that's something that I now am a little bit more mindful of because I've had to work against it so many times. But yeah, I would definitely say it's an interesting experience on my end where I've only been on the agency side. Emerson, I know you've only been on the company side. And so I think that there's an interesting difference in not just like the volume of things that you see. Obviously, I will see a lot in a short period of time across different industries. But I think that the way that we're able to learn how to be a RevOps professional is very different as well, because you report directly to key stakeholders that they're on your W-2 or you're on their W-2, right? And I work for the company, right? I work for the agency. So it's I think also an interesting dichotomy between both of those experiences as well. Emerson, I'll let you add any input on.
Yeah, as you're talking, like I'm feeling this weird anxiety where I'm like, how do you know in an agency role where you look at a portal? It's because there's so many, you could pull on this string over here and then it affects something way over here. And I have built like this understanding of my portal over a good amount of time to know generally if I pull this string, it's going to affect this. And so I need to
Right.
talk to that person. And I still get myself in all sorts of trouble. I'm just like, God, how do you do that in an agency role? Does people just start, what's happening here? You messing up my systems.
Yeah, I have some experience with this dealing with some other CRMs, let's say, that have it's just built on top and built on top, and you're like, you have this field and that field, and they're like the same. You're like, what is the difference? What happens if I delete this? It feels like that guy trying to defuse a bomb, and he's like, do I cut the green wire or the red wire? And at a certain point, you're just like, oh, I'll just take a shot. But yeah,
Uh,
it's terrifying.
And I feel like,
and
Cameron, you have to have a solution for that, right? I'm sure you have processes built into how you work with clients to mitigate.
make them love you so much that when you accidentally create 10,000 deals, they don't want to fire you and kill you. But no, the yes and no. So I'm not going to lie. Like I've made the mistake. We've all made the mistake of accidentally doing something because of some type of oversight or unintended consequence of something that was existing long before we were involved, right? It does happen. And candidly, that's why, speaking for myself, I tend to get other eyes on things before I turn anything on. So I will have the stakeholders sign off on, hey, we're going to turn this on. This is the intended effect. Please review to make sure there's no other things that should affect it. Now, fortunately for me at Rev Partners, we have a wonderful team as well of technologists, engineers, developers. So oftentimes I get their eyes on things that where they will catch mistakes that I might have made. And they're really good at being able to pull on the thread and say, hey, by the way, if we turn this on, there's 4 other workflows that are going to conflict. So let's bring that up. So candidly, I'm not always the one that's finding exactly what's wrong with let's just go live. Sometimes that is my knee-jerk reaction. But at the end of the day, I do tell the stakeholders like you are going to sign off on us on this going live, and we are going to be jointly responsible for what happens next. And I'll take ownership of fixing and troubleshooting and making sure that, if I broke something, I fix it. That alleviates the pressure of, oh, what did I just do? And nobody else knew what was going on.
Interesting. There's no undo button in RevOps, unfortunately. So yeah,
No.
you got to be
Yeah,
careful.
yeah, that's what.
But if I almost feel like it would be cool if there was a restore point in HubSpot.
Mhm.
So just like a
Oh man.
computer can have a hard restore back to a previous date, I feel like that would be helpful in HubSpot. It would be very dangerous, and I feel like only one person should ever have access to it. But like a nuclear key code, you have to have 2 owners, and only the owners can jointly set it up. I don't know, but
It sounds like a
Yeah.
great business idea. I know that many websites have that so that you can revert if something happened and everything crashes, you can go back. to a previous version of it. Yeah, sounds like something we should do.
But then
I
our
have had instances where I've had to export everything from HubSpot because I turned on a workflow that might break stuff. And then as a backup, now at least I have all the sheets. But
yeah, I've had a couple Coefficient, which is a tool I use quite a lot. They released the feature where they can essentially it pulls data from HubSpot into Google Sheets and you can do all sorts of analysis and things. But they released the ability to push from Google Sheets back to HubSpot. And I happen to have a spreadsheet that was it saved me because it was like a snapshot that I took months ago. And I accidentally changed the close date of a bunch of deals. I didn't even know how I did. I know how I did it, but it was stupid. But anyway, Coefficient saved my butt because I could just go back and restore all of those. And I'm like, yeah, that's why I was thinking, Mark. I was like, how do you turn this into a product? Because this was great.
Yeah, I think about it over the weekend.
Yeah.
speaking of products, something that I like to ask a lot of people in the community, and I think we talked about this at Inbound, but the notion that your CRM is a product, not a project. And I'm curious because I've spoken to some people that say it's semantics. I don't feel that way. I think there's a very clear difference. I'm curious if you've heard that, if you recall that, or you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know the difference between project and product. I think maybe product is more what people are saying is there's more emphasis on this is a continually evolving. You need to listen to your end users, get their feedback, make sure that it's just the most usable, user-friendly thing that you can. And there's no project end date to that. It's a continual process.
Yeah, it's not a fixed point in time where you say closed, project closed, on to the next thing. It's a continually evolving thing. I would definitely say that is applicable to a lot of things that unfortunately aren't seen that way. I think there's a lot of rigidity in the way companies do processes and tools where it's okay, this is done. Now let's move on to the next thing in the sprint. Never really looking, hey, things changed. Do we need to adapt to those changes?
Yeah, and that's the very reason why I added there's a very specific review period where you don't just pile up a bunch of projects during that process. It's no, we need to look at the changes, get user feedback. And for me, that's generally about a month of time where I'm like, all right, we made the changes. Let's see how it works before we just jump onto the next thing and forget about it.
Do you have a like folks on your team that are like beta testers for you before you like release it to a larger if you make a change like that?
Yeah, a lot of times my CEO is really focused on change management. And one of the things that he had said is find your most pain in the ass end user and use them to test out because they're going to tell you regardless whether they like it or not. So you may as well make it a useful process. And so I started doing that for some of the major things. And I'll tell you, it's not like always the most pleasant experience. I'd love to have someone someone testing it who's like really good at giving constructive feedback. But I'll tell you, it is really useful to have someone who will just tell you how it is and how much they hate everything that you've done. Yeah, okay, fair enough. Let me fix some of this stuff. And honestly, yeah, I recommend it to everybody. Just find your biggest pain and use them to try out these new features.
With that, I know we'll be wrapping in a second here. What I want to do, Emerson, is give you the floor to speak to any revenue operations professionals out there, any HubSpot users, and just offer up any advice, whether that's mistakes you've made that they can learn from or general advice that can help others to grow in their careers.
Yeah, I think the biggest things for me, be a part of the community. The Sprocketeer Slack now, I almost said Discord, but we've transitioned over to Slack, is an incredible place to, even if you're not in revenue operations, like if you want to be like go check out the problems that people are facing on a daily basis and get yourself a free HubSpot subscription and kind of practice alongside with what people are doing. Or if you are in revenue operations or a HubSpot user, like definitely join that group. There's some other groups as well that I'd highly recommend. But yeah, be a part of the community. Always focus on helping others, and I think to get ahead in your career, we're all inherently selfish. So if you can use that to your advantage and support people in their goals, really understand what motivates them and make sure that the work that you're doing is in support of that. And I think you'll go pretty far. And then find yourself a mentor who knows a little bit more than you do or a lot more than you do. And I think that can help you avoid a lot of mistakes in the learning process if you find someone who's willing to spend the time with you each week to keep you on track.
I think that just to that point, being a part of the community is super important, especially because it really is a tight-knit community.
Yeah.
There are a lot of us who, you and I, for example, Mark, you and I, like we only met at Inbound 6, 7 months ago. And I would consider a lot of us to be pretty close to friends now. We're pretty close as friends now. And so if you're able to come into Sprocketeer and the HubSpot community as a whole and make yourself known and just contribute and be a thought partner to people who maybe don't even know how brilliant you are, that will go a long way. Then you can use that to better your career.
Yeah.
I know if I ever lose my job, I can go to anybody in the Sprocketeer community, and I can probably they know my work, and it allows me to be take a few more risks career wise, which is always nice. Yeah, community, man, it's everything as far as success and also just happiness.
Yeah, it's what's his name? I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book called like Jab Right Hook or something.
Gary V.
There you go. And the whole idea was that you give and build up that kind of equity, and then when you need to ask, it's there. And yeah, cares.
That's it. Community is important.
We love you
Mark,
guys.
y'all are my besties. Mark, I'd say you know quite a bit about community in your role.
Yeah, I do. And I think that it's just a different manifestation of kind of the same thing, I think. And it just gives us the opportunity to connect with people. I think previously it was through in person events that we network, we built our own networks. When we all went remote, there was a need that was being filled by some of these online communities, Sprocketeer, RevOps Co-op, these kind of places. And that was a need that needed to be filled. And so there are these places now where you can build those connections through LinkedIn, and I spend all my day on LinkedIn. And so I think there's actually more opportunity in a remote world to expand your network than potentially an in-person world. And it's all about trying to be authentic and providing value. That's, I think, the important part.
Mark, always a pleasure when we get to do these Sprocket Pods. You are a wealth of knowledge. Emerson, thank you so much for joining us today. You are truly brilliant. Hostler is so lucky to have you. Even when we met the other day for a live working session, watching you break down lead scoring, which I myself have built numerous times, I was able to learn quite a bit. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's fun.
Have a great
Absolutely.
weekend.
For those who are tuning in, thank you very much. Follow all of us on LinkedIn, Cameron Collins, Mark Lerner, Emerson McCuin. You can also join us and chat with us in the Sprocketeer community group. Links are in the show notes. Don't forget to register for the admin hug. Those are hosted on Tuesdays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And if you haven't seen all of our SprocketPod episodes, you can check them out on YouTube. Again, links in the show notes. Thank you very much, everyone, and Sprocket on. Bye now.